Hi, welcome to Shakti Stories podcast, where we talk about embodiment, pleasure, dreams, relationships, and psychotherapy. We ask, what is the feminine? And where does women's sexuality and eros meet soul in today's modern world? My name is Angela Anamkara, and I'm so glad you're here. I hope you love Shakti Stories. If it touches you, please head over to iTunes to give it a 5-star review and follow me on Spotify to receive new episodes as they're released. I think you're going to love this episode. Sally Kempton, a former swami in the Vedic tradition, has been practicing and teaching for over 4 decades, sharing her profound knowledge of the texts of yoga and tantra with practical wisdom from contemporary psychology. Today, we talk about Eros, the goddess, and so much more. As Sally says, the divine feminine knows that a birth sometimes demands a death, and that the personal self sometimes has to die if the world is to be made sacred. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sally.
My complete pleasure. It's very nice to be with you, Angela.
Well, I'm so excited to have you. To me, it's like, this feels like a peak kind of experience because with, the podcast, it's like always surprising me where it's going. And to me, this just feels like having such a dedicated yogini, bringing your wisdom. It's just really such a gift.
Well, I guess we can say we're all gifts to each other right now, aren't we?
True. Yeah. Yeah. So, it's funny because I've done a couple of yoga teacher trainings. My mom was a yoga teacher. And I married someone who was really deep in the Vedic teachings for 25 years. But when I started reading like Awakening Shakti for the second time, actually, both times it's like I feel like a newborn. Like I just feel like brand new to yoga, really.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I know. It's extraordinary when you start to meditate on Shakti, how it transforms your understanding about your yoga, your life, your identity, and pretty much everything else.
Yeah, I'm so excited to ask you that very first question starting off. Can you tell us what is Shakti?
Yes. Well, I'm going to give you the hardcore tantric understanding of Shakti. In Tantra, especially in the non-dual Shaiva Tantra, which is the tradition that I've studied and practiced and which I teach, the understanding about the divine. We're going to do metaphysics because it's the only way I know how to explain
that's so deep.
The understanding about the divine is that it has 2 aspects that are inseparable. One is the clarity and transcendent quality of the witness, which in the tradition is known as Shiva, and the dynamic, creative love aspect, which is known as Shakti. And mythologically, they're often depicted as a god and a goddess. Yeah. But in fact, they are utterly non-separate, very, infinitely subtle realities. And the Shakti is that energy which manifests worlds. And also, and this to me is the most important thing, Indian philosophy, all Indian philosophy has many topics, but pretty much every philosophical tradition, especially the ones we study in the contemporary West, is essentially about liberation. So, along with explaining how, their perspective on what the world is, what ethics are, how we know things, fundamentally, they want to show you how to recognize your true self and liberate yourself from suffering. And the different paths, of course, have different approaches to this. But in the understanding of the Tantra is that the power which liberates you is Shakti, because it is Shakti who has basically made you. You're made out of Shakti, and your senses are designed to give you an experience of duality. So if you're going to experience non-duality, you actually have to have the controls, the governors taken off, which is one of the reasons why honoring Shakti, devotional practice relating to Shakti, is considered absolutely necessary for spiritual progress in Tantric traditions.
Okay. Wow. I love that. So this is so good. It's like I'm just loving how you can you have such a depth around the esoteric piece. And it's like, it makes me so curious about what this all is in our daily lives. And, what your sense is, why did you choose the goddess in particular to spend so much time on in your work?
Well, okay, so to answer the first part of your question, that given that Shakti is everything, Shakti is the world, Shakti is your mind, Shakti is whatever exists. And therefore, if you want to make progress in your life, if you want to experience relief from emotional pain, if you want to work with your suffering in really skillful ways, the quickest route, the most profound route, is to connect to the energy that's at the heart of everything. So in practical day-to-day terms, we could say that Shakti is energy, Shakti is subtle energy. It's our ordinary experience of Shakti is generally speaking through the prana. There's one of my teacher friends often says that in daily life, the Shiva aspect, the transcendent aspect, is awareness, and the Shakti aspect is prana. So, and my own experience, probably yours as well, is that when we bring awareness to the breath, to the prana Shakti as it moves through the breath, that's when we're actually able to transform our experience, whether it's through yoga, through meditation, through pranayama, or just through being attentive to our life energy. So that's hopefully a helpful answer to why is this, what does this have to do with day-to-day life? I can tell you, I was on the spiritual path. I've been at this a long time. And when I first got involved in yoga and meditation, it was in the 70s when it was a very different story than the way things are now. You basically couldn't find a yoga studio. I think there was one yoga studio in downtown Manhattan, which was where I lived at the time. A very different story today. And my first rodeo, as it were, was with a Western spiritual group, which was very influenced by Western mysticism, by Tibetan yoga, and was actually extremely good at, certainly helped me understand what the spiritual path was about. But one of the things that was missing was a sense of transformative, grace-filled spiritual energy. And I would say that this is what is missing in most yogic and spiritual traditions, the ones where you feel energy. Honestly, my first experience of spiritual energy was in a Catholic chapel in New Jersey, where I grew up. So the Catholics there's a lot of Shakti in Catholic ritual. Because I would say partly because of their lineage, partly because of their worship of Mother Mary, and I'm sure the worship of Jesus as well. So Shakti has to be cultivated, and one of my first introduction to Shakti as a significant aspect of spiritual life was when I was through a Tibetan teacher whom I attended a workshop with in, I guess, about 2 years after I first got involved in the path. And at one point, he I won't tell you the whole story, but he transmitted an experience of witness consciousness to me. And afterwards, after I came out of it, which one usually does after one of those experiences, I found that my entire inner body had changed. What I later realized was that I had experienced a Kundalini awakening. What occurred was that the practices that I'd been doing, which I'd never felt like I could do right, that we were doing a lot of visualizations. I couldn't visualize worth a darn. All of a sudden, the visualizations were occurring spontaneously. I was having visions. I was experiencing radical bliss. And on top of that, like we could say the dark side of that kind of awakening is that all of my buried emotional issues were surfacing. So this is what Shakti does when Kundalini is awakened. It gives you the experience of the powers, the bliss, the intuition, the profound intelligence, the subtlety of your real nature. And it also shows you all the schmutz that is blocking you. So that was the beginning for me of a relationship with Shakti. I didn't think of it as a goddess. I was, not just irreligious. I was embarrassed by the word God. But eventually, to make a long story short, it led me to my teacher, who was a Kundalini master, not Kundalini yoga, not the Yogi Bhajan brand, but the traditional Kundalini yoga, and whose specialty really was engaging Shakti. It filled his environment. It was the engine of grace that propelled the transformations that occurred around him. So I became really kind of a connoisseur of spiritual energy without any particular interest in the forms of the divine feminine or the divine masculine, for that matter. And I was with him for about 8 years, from the time I met him until he left his body. And then he had given me initiation into sannyas, initiation as a swami. He gave me the name Swami Durgananda, which is, of course, one of the names of the primordial goddess in Hinduism, which didn't actually affect me very much. I wanted one of those, non-dual names, like Chaitanananda, or one of those names that stand for the absolute, the formless absolute. But after he left his body, his successor, who was a woman, was actually had a family tradition. She's Indian. She's from South India. She's a family tradition of goddess worship, and so she would do she would sponsor the primal goddess festivals. And during one of these festivals, I was telling a story during the 9-night goddess festival of Navaratri, and I talk about it in the book, when I was suddenly just overcome with ecstatic energy. And I realized that I was having darshan, as we say, of the goddess, of the form that I was speaking about. And from that moment on, I had my vision shifted in a way that was very palpable, and a lot of it had to do with my experience of the natural world. The ashram where I was living at the time is very, very beautiful. It's got, it's in the country. It has exquisite, very well-tended gardens, and the natural world that you encounter there is gorgeous, even if you're, not particularly awake. But this was like, they'd put light sparkles in every leaf, in every tree, and everything was suddenly filled with significance. I became a devotee of the goddess in a formless form. And then over time, I got interested in the stories. I like stories. So, I began to examine the mythology and understand the mythology. And at one point, it became clear to me that, given the fact that Shakti is everything, including our human personality, that I could look at the goddesses not simply as divine beings, but also as aspects of our humanity, and to realize that the different forms and faces of the goddess exist in the physical world, in the human world, in the human personality, that they have psychological significance. And that's really how the book Awakening Shakti came about. I decided I wanted to express this and help people, especially women, but not only women, understand how much our emotions and our style and and our preoccupations and the qualities of our personality are actually allied to different divine powers. And I have found, and I'm very grateful and humbled by the fact that many other people have found also that when you get this, when you get the connection between your human personality and divine energy, it really changes your view of yourself. So that's my story in short form.
Yes. Thank you for sharing. I love that. Like, as a therapist, I've just found it so fascinating, that
Yeah.
because people come in such heavy states, often like depression, struggle getting out of bed, numbing, or the other side of anxiety and, such intense energy. And I also love I didn't mention yet the other book that I love, the audiobook, Doorways to the Infinite.
Yeah.
But I love the practices you offer there because I've just found they've been integrating in my therapy work because it's like, it's actually gives you that it's very similar to focusing a little bit the way that
Yeah.
like the initial inward, I don't know if you've heard of focusing, but
Yeah. Eugene Chandler book.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
holotherapy I do
Great
and
book.
thrown in love with, so I'm like, oh, this is so cool because it focusing, but it also adds what you're saying there where you have that you can direct your intention in particular ways and call on certain qualities and cultivate those within.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I've just been just so amazed by that, how, it's not, this is not just for people who are feeling pretty good and stable and, something extra. It's actually like, to me, it's so profound how you can ride in the, anger or the fear and actually travel through that into, as you say, like into a deeper spiritual understanding.
Yeah. I mean, this is part of the glory of Tantra, is that it really is a tradition that shows you how to take every aspect of your life and make it a path. Yeah. And yeah, I think it's fabulous that you're working with these practices with clients.
Yeah, I mean, again, I have so much to learn in terms of, what you're offering, but it's just beautiful how because focusing takes that similar stance of actually like, okay, rather than the label and analyzing it, like just staying in our left, going in circles, actually, it's like, let's go into that energy, let's go into the body. And really, it's more than just a feeling, like a somatic feeling in the body, but that you can find that that like that greater essence of yourself as you go into it. You can feel that expansion.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, have you found, on that topic, have you found that people generally have said that even when they're in quite dark places, they've been able to find um like light in this work and find a way forward?
Oh yeah. Yeah, and there's another factor which to me is very important, and it's is the grace factor that that is really intrinsic to this tradition. It's a devotional tradition. It's often said that people who invoke Shakti, who let's just call a spade, people who worship Shakti, um, with devotion, very often do it for the sake of acquiring power. And by power, it could mean many kinds of power, that help in your work. Power over others, the power to be attractive. Many, many worldly gifts are possible through invoking Shakti. But most important, it's very hard to make spiritual progress without receiving the power of grace. We really can't do it on our own. We don't have that ability, most of us. I mean, obviously there are people who do. I mean, there's that whole Promethean mythology of the West, which is that a strong person, especially a strong guy,
Right.
can defy the laws of the universe and prevail. This is not true for most of us. and and of course Prometheus got roundly punished for his, let's call it, hubris. uh, and so there's another way,
Yeah.
which is to really humbly recognize that there are benevolent powers in this universe which deeply want to help us, which are completely available, even, waiting for us to ask for help. And that when we understand that, and when we understand what they are and how close they are to us and are willing to ask, that healing happens in what we normally call miraculous ways. So along with understanding that, you can find, let's say, the seed of suffering in your body through intense focus and even transmute it with your focus, you can also find that seed of suffering and deeply ask for help. And that's part of what Shakti is about. I mean, it's, this is at the heart of Christian practice, obviously, and of course, many other practices, that, that the understanding of higher beings, of higher energies, is not just there for the sake of, giving money to the priestly class. It's there because it affords human beings, a way to receive help when there is no help available from the human world. So because most of us have no power, most people in this world are poor, most people in this world are sick, most people in this world are oppressed in one way or another. So where are we going to turn? I was just reading a piece in the Times about Christianity, and it quoted a theologian named Harold Thurman, who's a Black theologian. One of the things he says is that the real reason why we need Jesus in the Christian church is because Jesus is there for people who have no other source of help, no other source of comfort. And of course, this is true in every tradition, that, and it's perhaps the reason why even very rational people at some point begin to recognize, not all rational people, but many rational people, begin to recognize that there is an energy in the cosmos that you can appeal to as an other, as a helpful other, as a thou, as Martin Buber says, to expand your consciousness, to heal your suffering, and just as as somebody to talk to when there's nobody else to talk to. So I'm a very strong believer in being present to subtle energies, higher energies, to personalizing them, and to communicating with them.
Yes.
So goddess, I happen to be drawn to the feminine at this point in my life, but it's not about the feminine, it's about higher powers.
Right. Wow. I feel like I'm getting such a download here.
I did lay it on pretty thick, right?
Okay, I love that. I'm super curious because probably my favorite practice at the moment in Doorways to the Infinite was that practice on desire, on really following desire in, and finding that as a doorway into the depth of who you are. And it's just ongoing, the exploration. It's just this it's just, to me, so powerful to work with desire in this way because there's just been so much suppression around that. And
I know.
about how so many other practices usually suppress this piece of spiritual growth, and spiritual exploration. What could you say about the
desire? Yeah. Well, I think the bottom line with desire is that it is the engine of creativity. So again, just to return to the tantric texts, the tantric metaphysics, in tantra, the desire to create, which arises out of the inner bliss of the union of the two aspects of the divine, it gives rise to desire, and that desire is what impels the creation of the universe. The whole thing about tantric psychology is that the understanding is that there is an absolute continuum between the highest level of reality and us, and everything else as well. So that everything that is in the divine is also in us. And therefore, obviously, anything that we create, any action that we do starts with desire. There's a famous statement in one of the Upanishads, as is your will, meaning as is your desire. They usually translate it as will because desire has a bad name. But as is your desire, so is your thoughts. As is your thought, so is your deed. As is your deed, so is your experience. So desire is the source of anything. And of course, it's the source of procreation. That's the most obvious way that, that desire is significant in it. But it's also the source of artistic creation of, pretty much anything we do. If you don't have a desire, there's no motivation. Desire is motivation. So what the Vijnana Bhairava does is it takes sexual desire, which, as you say, is pretty much demonized in the yogic world, and it asks you to focus intensely on the rising experience of sexual desire, and to allow yourself to focus so intensely in the actual experience of desire without acting it out, without trying to take it anywhere, without physicalizing it, without manipulating it, let's say, in any way, and allow that desire to reveal what it is, and what it will reveal itself as essentially is ecstasy. It will reveal itself in myriad ways, but I would say it is a doorway into exquisite bliss. And of course, sexuality, if it's good, is blissful. But in my experience, this is way beyond ordinary sexual ecstasy. It's because, what sexual ecstasy wants to do is give us a taste of the intrinsic ecstasy that's the source of our life. So in a certain sense, you could say that, okay, if the yogis say don't let your desire lead you into physical expression, it's not, or it shouldn't be, or it originally wasn't. It wasn't a critique of sex as such. It was a pointing out that there's a deeper, subtler experience that if you can stay with that, is actually more satisfying than anything else, anything that you could do on the physical plane, and is available in the physical plane. Is as long as you're willing to go to the subtlety within it.
Right. If you can stay with that and
not dissipate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's
so. Yeah. It's actually the difference between, that there's an utterly orgasmic experience of subtle ecstasy that occurs when you go into desire, or that can occur that goes into desire. And again, in my experience, that type of ecstasy is very much associated with goddess. And what I think many of us have had that experience more or less spontaneously at different times. And it's definitely a part of the best sexual experiences. When you add connection to the goddess and goddess practice, and, to the intention to allow yourself to mine the depths of what desire really is, it's just extraordinary. And, people talk about all body orgasm. It's kind of an all body, all worlds, mind opening form of arousal that's quite extraordinary, and really combines the human and the divine, in a way that's absolutely unmistakable. So you're nodding. I gather that you know this experience.
Yeah, it's, I love, actually, it's funny because I think I bought Awakening Shakti many years ago, but I found it was so much to digest.
Yeah, it's a lot of it.
It wasn't until this year that I just dove back into it recently. But
you didn't get to the chapter on Lalita until recently.
No, I was going to say, I don't think I made it to chapter 20 until recently. Yeah. And when I did, I was like, oh, this describes an experience I had perfectly it was about 10 years ago. I was 27. I had just handed in my thesis and I went on a week-long meditation retreat. And there's a bit more to the story, but the gist of it is that I had this real bliss experience. And when you describe that thousand petal chakra, you said, I was just so intrigued by that. 'Cause like, that's exactly what I felt. I felt this opening and all this bliss. And I've never experienced anything like that. Well, I mean, I've never experienced that quite like, again, exactly, it was mind blowing. Everything was just so perfect. I was like, oh, everything is perfect. Everything. And so that's cool that you brought that up, because I wanted to ask you a couple questions around this. One around that, the erotic goddess Lalita, and how you speak about that in Awakening Shakti. And I'm so curious to just hear a little bit more about how that's relevant today. How is her energy or qualities important today?
Excuse me. So I want to be clear, for the sake of Hindu orthodoxy, that I've done quite a bit of interpretation of the goddess Lalita based on my own inner experience, and also on, let's call it channeled information that has kind of came through me as I was writing the book. So Lalita, whose full name is Lalita Tripura Sundari, which means the playful, beautiful one of the three worlds being the waking, dreaming, and deep sleep state, and also has other meanings. But Lalita is a form of the primordial Shakti. She's a form of the great goddess, the goddess who contains everything. And she's a warrior, but she's a consort. She's partnered with Shiva in mythology. And the pictures of her show her being supported by four male gods, by the three deities of the Hindu Trinity, Brahma, Vishnu, and Rudra, and another form of Shiva, and also sitting on a lotus that comes out of Shiva's navel. So literally rising from the prone form of Shiva. So, and it's very highly symbolic, because it's intended to convey the fact that she's the queen of the world. She's the source of reality, and it is her desire which gives birth to the world. And there's another meaning to it, which is that Shiva, the divine masculine, is inert without having his Shakti activated. So Shiva is shown in Shavasana, in a kind of a erotic swoon, you might say, with her kind of triumphantly emerging, sitting on a throne, coming out of his navel. And she's invoked in several different forms, including the famous Shri Yantra, which which you can find on the internet and show people if you want to, which actually it depicts the way that the universe arises from the heart of reality. And there's a circle in the center, tiny little circle in the center, which is said to be the seat of God and goddess in union. And then there are triangles that erupt out of it, which represent all the different levels of reality. So she's that. And she also, the relationship of Shiva and Shakti in this particular form is highly erotic. They are lovers. They spend, kind of half their time making love and the rest of their time talking about philosophy. So, they're very much at the heart of the tantric understanding of life. Life as both the expression of bliss, which is quintessentially erotic. In other words, the understanding in Tantra is that eros is the love energy that gives rise to reality, and it can be expressed sexually, but it's also expressed in music. It's expressed in different forms of pleasure. It's expressed in the plants growing from the earth. It's expressed in every aspect of the natural world. The kind of quivering eros of our connection to each other, the dance we do with each other. So that's who Lalita is, and that's what Lalita style eroticism is. yes, it is sexual, but it's not only sexual. One of a teacher that who I like, who talks about this, says sex models eros. It doesn't exhaust eros, because eros is really the life force itself.
Right. Okay.
So our experience of sexuality is, for most human beings, the closest we come to really getting a sense of how profound, our erotic connections to each other really is. But what, tantric spirituality, and I would say all spirituality, really offers us is the opportunity to realize that this is in everything, and it's available, in every level of our experience.
Wow. That's really powerful.
Yeah, it's the truth. It's why we're alive.
Okay, so that leads me to another question. When you're speaking about this, from what I've noticed in the past maybe 10 years, more and more I see people talking about Kundalini awakenings. I'm not sure. I'll be interested to hear what you say about that term for what people are describing. But more and more people are doing breath work. They're doing psychedelic, right? And they're having these big experiences. And I'm finding this even more and more with my clients who are sort of and they're coming from these places of very not always in that exalted state, but they've connected in with something.
Yeah.
I'm so curious to know what your sense is of those experiences that we can have through an altered state. It's real, like you feel it in a very real way, but is it, from the meditation perspective, is it kind of like getting ahead and getting this like peek into what is possible? What's your sense of that?
Well, yeah, I would say that what you say is true, that, that clearly there are brain states that are I don't know the language for this, but there just as there are cannabis receptors in the body, just as there are opioid receptors in the body, there are clearly psychedelic receptors in the body. So when you put one of those substances into the body, it's going to trigger certain brain states, certain body states. And my first experience of divine love was during an acid trip. So I could never trash psychedelics. That are extremely important to me. But that said, that experience, took about, I think it lasted maybe not even 24 hours.
Yeah.
Totally changed my life. But, I chased it for a couple of years. And I'll be very honest, the experience that I had in that state was an experience of my heart just flinging open, which I've actually never had. I took a lot of acid in the couple of years after that experience. And honestly, once I had become used to it, and this has been true ever since, I periodically take psychoactive drugs, but I haven't for a few years because I found that it's rarely that interesting. In other words, somehow I know that that I'm going to have these reactions. There are going to be certain visual distortions. I'll have some emotional experiences. I'll become embodied or disembodied depending on the drug and the day, etc. But it has never since been. Well, actually, the first time I took ayahuasca, it was pretty radical, but it's never been that radical since. And I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I didn't take enough. But it's kind of like once the brain knows, what the effect of a drug is going to be, it's not going to rock your world in the same way I've found. Now, comparing that to meditation and breath work and yoga, I know I don't do a lot of that dramatic breath work that has become very fashionable these days. I have some friends who teach it and do it. I've had a few experiences, it can really bring up your energy, brings up your Shakti. I would say breath work probably is the most dramatic in this, in its ability to accelerate Shakti-driven experience in the body. Meditation, at least for me, tends to be more subtle. But the thing about it is, that it lasts. When you meditate deeply, it's not over when you get off the mat. I mean, it permeates your day. It changes your consciousness, and it continues to change your consciousness, especially if you practice. Which, with all of its powers, and I have great respect for psychedelics. Psychedelics alone won't do. So I think they've been very useful to thousands of people, and shown us that the inner world exists. But at some point, you have to take the trip yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate that. That really did answer my question, because that's my sense too, is that I also have had powerful experiences and realized that there's ways of moving through blocks, even that you just can't always even get to or imagine. By sitting in meditation, you may not get to that place because of sometimes your own ego is even blocking you,
Yeah.
Be a powerful throughway and opening. But then there is something, as you were saying, about the longer lasting nature of the meditation journey. It's like, okay, I know that I'm doing this. I know that either way, it's you. I mean, we have psychotropic minds, but
Right.
it's the fact that you don't, there's nothing to become dependent on with meditation. It's actually, a very conscious practice.
Well, and also, it's not going to mess up your body.
Yeah, I was just going to say, there's like no risk.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I like MDMA a lot. And, it's an incredibly valuable practice for psychotherapy, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
But the thing is, when you take MDMA, it uses up all your serotonin, and if you do too much of it, and by too much of it, I know many people I know, it's like 3 or 4 journeys, then it takes you months to get your serotonin back up to speed. So the cost of psychedelics is high.
Yeah, there's a real crash, and I so agree. There may be longer term impacts with that. So, okay, this is just so great. So there's a couple other questions I want to ask you. One was about just coming back to Lalita. There was one other thing I wanted to ask you. When I'm thinking about the goddess as having this like erotic element, and how people are starting to tap into that, one thing that came to mind was people more and more have been coming to me. I've just been noticing in client sessions, clients are asking about whether they, like women, I see mostly women, and they're finding attraction to other women, and they're wanting to explore, like, am I bisexual? What does this mean? I'm super curious to know what you'd say about whether it's something to do with the goddess waking up, and that, that it has something to do with us shifting from, more a patriarchal way to a more goddess loving way. And that's just showing up in people's daily lives and their attractions.
I think that's really possible. I mean, I see a lot of homoerotic activity all over the world, men and men, women and women. I don't know why it is. I think maybe because men and women are, in a certain respect, strangers to each other. It's one of the things I like about sexual polarity. Yeah. But admittedly, there's something very sweet about being with somebody who's just in your own gender, who gets you in a way that the other gender normally doesn't.
Yes.
Or it doesn't entirely. Yeah. And so I mean that's that's one reason for it. And I think also that as women become more centered in their own innate eroticism, and are willing to not be objects in the way that women have traditionally sort of seen themselves through the eyes of men, and enjoyed themselves as objects of desire, that feminine desire, female erotic desire, is, I think, the ability to experience it, the permission to experience it, is fairly new in the world. I mean, obviously women always have, but it's always been slightly, hidden and not okay. So I would say that in exploring your own desire nature, your own erotic nature, it's probably interesting to, to think of exploring another woman's erotic nature. It's female. Again, I have to admit, I don't have a wide amount of sexual experience. I mean, I certainly have been sexually active in my life, but not so much in the last 30 years or so. So I come from a time when not all the doors were as open as they are now. But my sense about lesbian activity is probably women have been attracted to other women forever, as men obviously have been attracted to other men forever. So now there's just more permission in our societies.
That's what I have really been telling people, normalizing that, hey, the gender and the sex of the other probably wouldn't matter so much it wouldn't be paid attention to so much in a different culture if we were in just a more accepting way with sexuality. And as you said, I think that's a great point, with women's power and women's right to just choose what they're drawn to and explore.
Yeah. And, and that sort of natural narcissism that human beings have, I want to see myself in another person. It's somewhat easier to see yourself in another person if they're in a body that looks like yours.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I still want to ask you one other thing about, so I know that you were a big part of the second wave feminist movement. And I was wondering how you see that has changed, how this new how has that changed for you as you've deepened in the spiritual teachings and path?
Well, this is a complex topic for me because the women's movement, the second wave women's movement, was utterly seminal in my journey. I mean, it was really a part of my personal liberation. And I was, the aspect of the women's movement that I was involved in was it was an organization called the New York Radical Feminists, which was it was a pretty radical aspect of the women's movement, and one of the original groups. It was, so I guess after about 2 years, when women's liberation exploded as a cultural force, and the sort of mainstream feminism, that aspect of feminism, which involved Shirley Chisholm and Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem, and the very powerful grassroots work that began to be done. So that was going on, but what was going on in the more radical wing of the women's movement was two things. One, a strong anti-masculine bias, and a lot of emphasis on kind of separating yourself from men, which I wasn't willing to do, and also a tremendous amount of infighting. So, that, and which just became unbearable to me. I really just couldn't stand, all of that organizational infighting. So I kind of removed myself from the external women's movement, and it was about the same time that I got involved in spirituality. So I'd kind of put away all worldly things at that point. And when I got, this is where it gets complicated, and I'm not sure we want to go into all the details of this, but I had a male guru.
Share as much.
And he was Indian, which means that the attitude towards women in India, not so much now. I mean, there's been an enormous, there's a big feminist movement in India, and Indian women, once they're liberated from the old social strictures, are some of the strongest females in the world. So this is not about Indian women exactly, but it's about the culture, the religious culture that I entered when I entered that tradition. So it just went underground. I just went. It stopped being something that that I thought of in the same way that I had earlier. And so I mean, just to put it, I think more accurately, I became much more focused on internal growth than I was on social action. It was only later that, once I had done enough internal growth that I trusted myself. Because, one of the things about social movements is that our wounds get so mixed up in them that if we're self-aware, if we're honest with ourselves, we can't be entirely sure that that we're in clarity about let's say, whose fault it is that we're suffering.
Right.
So for me, it was very important to clarify my own motivations, my own character, before I started looking around and saying, oh, wait a minute, this isn't fair. This is oppressive, and it's not just women, it's capitalism, it's racism, it's, it's all those things that, of course, we all know, we're all very familiar with now. But I very much believe that, let's see how to put this, that it's a little bit, it's a chicken and egg issue, because until we have real opportunity, education, work opportunities, cultural opportunities, it's very hard to understand ourselves. And yet, unless we understand ourselves, we're just going to recreate the same conditions that we came out of. So, I guess you could say if I have a mission at this point, it really is to integrate inner work and social justice, psychological work and doing what we can do to change the structures of society. But looking at, especially this week in the United States, looking at the polarization, the condition. I'm not going to critique the white supremacist activists, though I have a lot, though I think they're horrible. But their interior, there's a kind of interior awareness that we need to cultivate if we're actually going to be effective in changing the external world. And what I just did, calling the white supremacist people who stormed the US Capitol, calling them horrible, was, not something that I'm not going to say I take it back, but I would say that that until people learn how to change from within, we're not going to have a satisfactory transformation of our society. And this said, with all honor for the people who are actually effectively changing society, especially Black people, especially my political friends, they're doing extraordinary work. But the thing I notice is that the ones who are able to do it with a form of ease and calm and what I would call deep justice are almost without exception people who have a spiritual life. Either they're Christians, as many Black activists are, or they're Buddhists. So there's understanding that it starts inside.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Deep justice. Wow. Well, you've offered so much wisdom. I'm excited to listen over this again. One other thing I just wanted to ask, is there anything you could say about what the need is for Shakti right now in the world?
Well, we have Shakti always.
Right.
We can't get rid of her. She's us. Yeah. I would say the need, okay, so one of the great insights about Shakti is that, and this is very hard for Westerners, especially Westerners from the Judeo-Christian traditions, to understand, Shakti is everything. So she has her dark face, her shadow face, as well as her light face. And what I believe what we need is is to honor the dark face, rather than putting it outside of us, while at the same time recognizing that that we want to live in the light. So somehow to find a way of integrating, understanding, not demonizing or putting outside of ourselves, our shadow aspects, and and not giving into them. So I think that's what we need. We have Shakti if you just ask for her to be present. The great Ramakrishna Paramahamsa used to pray, Mother, show me your liberating face, not your binding face, not your oppressive face. Right. So it's her liberating face that we need. It's hope and and the power to make change both internally and externally, and and trust that if we are sincere and clarify our motivations and are courageous and are willing to to take risks in humble petition, that she's going to help us. But life is mystery, and maybe the human race is not meant to be permanently on this earth. I mean, that it may be that we're not here forever.
Yeah.
And that the goddess Earth might just say, enough of these world destroying humans.
Right.
So in a way, if you're going to worship her, if you're going to love her, if you're going to invoke her, you have to realize she has her own agendas, and we have, and our obligation ultimately is to life. It's not simply to our personal needs and desires, though of course we have an obligation to ourselves, but she's not just soft, she's tough.
Yeah. Wow. You've just said so much today that I think I think it'll just, for myself, I can say it'll continue to percolate and I think have a really strong impact on how I continue to see things. And I really so much appreciate that you showed up today. I think one of the earlier words you said was grace. And I really felt that. I actually felt through this conversation just very alive and excited and so curious and also humbled. And so it was, I really, really appreciate that you showed up today and shared your spiritual depth and wisdom.
Well, thank you, Angela. And thank you so much for everything that you're doing. We're all part of a huge wave of feminine wisdom.
Yes, I know it. Yeah. It feels like something's, it's like Shakti story seems to have a life of her own. I'm just.
Yeah, she definitely does.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone who sees and hears this. And, may we all be ecstatic in our embodiment. So thank you, Angela, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you for joining us at Shakti Stories, where we are empowering feminine bliss.